boys in her bed had a double motive: make sure she never had to sleep alone and have someone on hand ready to kill for her. She had broached the subject with Jesse a few times, but he always ignored her. He had developed that strange kind of cordial relationship with Kevin, and the pair mostly bonded over their shared frustration with their woman's behavior. Jesse had even told Kevin on more than one occasion about the things Gina had been saying about getting rid of him, but Kevin simply chalked it up to more of his wife's nonsense. Once Jesse had gone and Larry had moved in hours after, Gina finally had the perfect accomplice in place to carry out her plan. 17-year-old Larry Wayne Kelly and his older brother were having difficulties in life, at home, at school, and it was when they joined the crew at Taco Bell that their lives seemed to get a bit better. Both dropouts of Butler High School, the brothers came from a home where the scores of dogs were paid more attention to than they were. Add in an unfriendly stepfather, and it's no wonder that Larry soon finds himself feeling safe and loved in Gina's clutches. It should come as no surprise that just after Kevin Spann announced that he was being stationed at Fort Knox, Gina started saying he'd begun physically abusing her. She even claimed rape, much to the younger men's dismay. As often and as graphically as she could, Gina would recount her episodes of domestic violence as a grooming technique to turn the boys against Kevin. She told them about the money and asked Larry's brother to help her, but he didn't bite. He told her that he'd done time and he didn't want to do any more. At the start of 1997, Kevin traveled back home to Illinois seeking advice from family. Even after Gina's mother and sister broke it to him that Gina didn't love him, he went back a few weeks later, one last time. Ironically, their biggest concern was that Kevin would kill Gina's lover in a fit of rage. So he returned, the same gentle, non-confrontational, non-homicidal husband and stepfather that he'd left as, finding, in turn, that Gina hadn't changed either. Though making the same income as before, Kevin financed a large above-ground pool for their rental as he'd always promised her. The couple had developed a financially based codependent relationship. Kevin has accrued quite a bit of debt while living above his means to please Gina, and divorce would drastically reduce his income. The Army would adjust his pay and he'd be back to a single man's salary but with a married man's debt. And the same was true for Gina. If Kevin divorced her, she would lose access to the present and future financial stability he represented. You would think that would be enough for her to kick Larry out. That Kevin installed her swimming pool and wasn't pressing their issues, though he clearly wanted to. By Valentine's Day 1997, Kevin had had enough again and threatened divorce, as he did from time to time. But this time, Gina was ready and threatened to lie to the Army and say that her son didn't live with them, prompting Kevin to back down. In April, Kevin was set to go to Fort Jackson, South Carolina for training. By this time, Gina had convinced young Larry that she was pregnant, and with no knowledge of her past, he was inclined to believe her. The same manipulation tactics she had always used to try and trap a man were manifesting themselves again. Gina and Larry were plotting, together, to end Kevin's life. They began searching for accomplices, anyone naive or desperate enough to do anything for money. Larry's stepdad had a gun and they would burglarize his home if necessary. And they did too, in April of 1997. Though a weapon was secured and the plan was in motion, neither Larry nor Gina had intentions of carrying out the murder themselves. Not only did Larry truly believe that Kevin was abusive, but he was convinced that Gina was pregnant with his baby. Kevin had grown wary of going home, even telling an army buddy that he was afraid to. Soon enough, he was busy with his out-of-state training at Fort Jackson, as well as the 2 part-time jobs he still worked. While Kevin was working himself as hard as ever, his wife was sending her lover to find his killer. The first person that came to mind was 16-year-old Christopher Bargeron, who used to hang out at Taco Bell and attended Butler High School. The teen quite nonchalantly agreed to payment of $15,000 to shoot Kevin Spann, implying that he would be the one to do it. In reality, Chris had no intention of carrying out the murder himself and immediately began to ask around Butler High School. As we have seen before, no one took him seriously. Even kids who were familiar with the couple from the restaurant still didn't take him at his word. Chris was known to be intelligent, but also, weird, so seeing something off the wall didn't exactly seem out of character for him. Soon, a Butler High 10th grader alerted Chris to the existence of one Gerald Horne, a truant freshman at Hephzibah High School living on his own at one of those seedy motels near the Taco Bell. Gerry was as nonchalant to Chris as Chris had been to Larry when speaking about murdering Kevin Spann, and he even implied that it wouldn't be his first time. Both were just in it for the prospect of quick cash, and neither thought ahead to the repercussions of their actions. Once the .38 Special was in Gerry's possession, he too realized that he wasn't cut out to be a triggerman, and looked instead to 16-year-old Hephzibah High School freshman Matt Piazzi, who had once mentioned that he'd killed a man before. And just like that, Gina and Larry had found their triggermen. After much haggling, the plan was fully in place. Even as Gerry, Horne, and Matt Piazzi prepared, in plain view of their friends and acquaintances, to kill Staff Sergeant Spann in cold blood, no one tried to stop them, much less alert authorities or the intended victim himself. One of the Spann vehicles was to be used in the crime to help stage it as a robbery. The boys arrived at Gina's house just after midnight on May 11, 1997, but didn't make it far enough into the house to see that Kevin was taking a bath. They left after stealing money and credit cards from Kevin's wallet. Gerry inexplicably discharged the weapon in the side yard of the house before they made a hasty getaway. Then, a scuffle in the stolen car resulted in another bullet fired, shattering a window in Gina's car. There were only 3 rounds left. It just so happened to be Mother's Day and Gina's tragic anniversary, so when young Matt Piazzi hadn't shown up after being gone from home for 4 days, his mother reported him missing. Little did she realize that her son was preparing to commit murder. He had told Gina that he would kill her husband since Gerry had seemingly lost his nerve. The pair set out that Mother's Day night, and around 10:30, they were at the Spann home on Old Waynesboro Road knocking at the door. Gina and Larry had dropped them off within walking distance and given them money for their cab ride after. She made sure to pick her son up before she dropped the killers off. As soon as Kevin Spann answered his front door and told the teens that Gina and Larry weren't home, 16-year-old Matt Piazzi shot him point blank in the face, and then once more in the neck when he was on the floor. The proud soldier who had lived through war had returned only to be murdered in his own home by some punk kids, his wife the mastermind. The killer and his accomplice took a cab to a restaurant near Gerry's motel. Gina and her son had called 911 from a store nearby her house. She had encountered her husband's killers waiting for their taxi there, so she discovered Kevin's body at their home, knowing that the deed had already been done.
911. Ambulance. Okay, what's the problem? I needed the door. There's blood my husband's on the floor.
Is he breathing?
I don't know.
Investigators thought that it was strange that Gina got in the car and left the house to call 911, and immediately thought that she and Larry were behaving oddly. The fact that the 17-year-old volunteered that the deceased was his girlfriend's husband, and that they all resided at this address, only heightened his curiosity level. He then laid out the events of their evening plainly, saying they'd gone out and run a few errands and that Gina had found the body once they'd returned, a story which matched Gina's almost identically. But at the station, it didn't take investigators an hour to get Larry to readily admit the real plan, and once Gina knew what Larry had said, she emotionlessly filled in the remainder of the details. Matt and Gerry were arrested and soon led police to the murder weapon, which they ditched in a bush. When Chris Bargeron, the original mastermind, was arrested, he lawyered up. 16-year-old Christopher Lee Bargeron, Gerald Lewis Horne, 18, 17-year-old Larry Wayne Kelly, and 16-year-old shooter Matthew Clark Piazzi were held at Richmond County Youth Detention Center and charged with malice murder, felony murder, and various weapons violations for killing Kevin Leroy Spann, as was his 31-year-old widow Gina. The five were indicted on June 3, 1997, and the state made it clear that they planned to seek the death penalty against Gina Spann. However, she sidestepped that plan by pleading guilty to malice murder just before Thanksgiving, so that the district attorney would take execution off the table for her as well as Larry. On November 21, 1997, Gina Spann received life without parole plus 5 years, sparing the families involved the need for a trial and saving herself and Larry from the possibility of execution. The remainder of her co-conspirators were also sentenced by the end of 1997. On December 1st, admitted triggerman Matt Piazzi, by then 17, pleaded guilty to felony murder and had his other charges dropped in exchange for his testimony against Larry and Gerry. Piazzi was sentenced to life without parole. A few days later, failed shooter Gerry Horne did the same and received life. Chris Bargeron, the 16-year-old intermediary who ultimately connected Gina to the killers, became the youngest person in Georgia history to defend himself in court. He successfully argued his own case and ended up receiving 5 years in prison for conspiracy, followed by 5 years probation. Many involved were impressed by his legal maneuvering at such a young age. Larry Kelly's court-appointed attorney saw this as an opportunity to get his client a sentence other than life, since neither boy had pulled the trigger or been present when the murder occurred, but he was unsuccessful. Larry pleaded not guilty and went to trial on December 8, 1997, and was found guilty on all charges, malice murder, felony murder, and weapons charges 2 days later. And all that insurance money? Well, his former fiancée came forward to stake a claim on his estate because she'd had their baby after they broke up. His beneficiaries were in order, however, so the money went to the secondary awardees on his policies, since in both Illinois and Georgia a murderer was legally barred from profiting from their crime. So Gina's sister and her son, the stepson Staff Sergeant Spann had always wanted to care for, received the $300,000 payouts. All that time he had fretted over possible harm done to his fertility. Kevin had had a biological child he didn't know about. Gerry Horne is 41 this year and serving his life sentence at Riverbend Correctional